Hi, I'm Cheryl Jackson. Every day it seems like we hear about another school shooting, a pedophile released in our midst, a child snatched by a stranger. But are these things happening as often as we think? Has the world become a more dangerous place? Do parents need to protect their children more than ever, or are we keeping our kids too safe for their own good? That's the focus of this special edition of Your Voice. It's the most natural instinct in the world, wanting to keep our kids safe. But when most of us think back to our childhoods, we remember being allowed to walk to school on our own, ride our bikes through the woods, and play in the street. And most of us were just fine. Yet as parents ourselves, few of us would be comfortable letting our children do any of those things. What has happened in a generation? We'll explore this issue with our expert panel in a moment. But first, meet Camille Tovey and Craig Jackson. They're parents of 3 kids, and they're the first to admit they may be just a tad overprotective.
Why are you slipping? I'm okay.
I'm Camille.
I'm Craig. We have 3 children. Scotia's 8, Gage is 1, and Ainsley is 5. I think we are a little bit overprotective as parents. I couldn't imagine telling my kids, sure, just go out and play until the streetlights come on and come on back when you get dark. No, I couldn't.
My biggest worry would be definitely, an encounter with a stranger, be it a child molester, a child pornographer, a drug dealer. We moved from Kapuskasing to Toronto about 2 years ago. And I'd say the difference between living in Kapuskasing, which is a population of less than 10,000 people, was the simple fact that we knew our neighbors. We knew our neighbors very well. Here, you're a lot more insular.
I want you guys to think about something for a minute, okay? What do you guys do if you're in the bathroom at school and you see a man come into the bathroom? What do you guys do?
Say, stop it, I don't like it.
Like that? Or do you say it really, really loud or really quiet?
Loud!
Good, try it.
Practice.
I would say we do a lot of education. We not only cover, the typical stranger danger and never get into anybody's car and passwords and such. We just moved to a new house and I only want them to play in the backyard because the backyard is completely fenced off. I know when we first moved down, my first concern was how close we were to the highway and somebody could come and grab the kids and take off and they'd be on the 401 within minutes. Sleepovers happen at our house.
I really wish I could sleep over at a friend's house. I've had a sleepover once with my sister in her own bed.
In terms of my daughters visiting the public washrooms, my 8-year-old is, almost 9-year-old, is only starting to go to these public facilities on her own, be it at a restaurant or the library, what have you. And we always tell her, you have 5 minutes. If you are not back in 5 minutes, I will go in and find you. And I usually don't make it past the 3-minute mark.
Although my mind knows we're safer here, part of my emotions don't. I don't know if you've ever been somewhere where at work everyone's buying a lottery ticket for the big lottery draw, and you buy it, not because you think you're going to win, but because you don't want to be the one fool left at work who didn't buy a ticket. And it's kind of the same thing here. I know the odds of terrible things happening are 1,000,000 to 1, but then they're my kids.
Personally, I tend to take a step back from the media because I know it definitely will up the fear factor or my reaction to certain situations. As such, I don't watch TV news anymore.
Oh, there's Mom! There she is!
Particularly with my daughter Scotia, who's older and is starting to be old enough to make her own decisions, I worry about smothering her because sometimes she gets very, very nervous and she will almost panic when it comes time to make a decision.
I think it's a dangerous place, you know why? Because there could be some strangers that you don't know. They could take you away and you can never see your parents again.
Night, Scotia.
Good night, Dad.
See you in the morning.
I don't know how to draw the line between paranoid and protective.
Ainsley.
I think some of the rules I put down, in a way, even if my kids don't feel it, do smother them by restricting their options, but all I want for them is to be safe. It's a new world out there.
So, how typical is the family we just saw? We'll get to that with our expert panel. Barbara Colaroso is a renowned parent educator based in Boston, Massachusetts. A former teacher, she now lectures, consults with schools, and is the author of several parenting books. Michael Unger is a professor of social work at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's the author of the book Too Safe for Their Own Good: How Risk and Responsibility Help Teens Thrive. Anthony Hutchinson is Executive Director of the Brampton Neighborhood Resource Center, an organization that helps high-risk children and families. He grew up at risk himself and is raising his children in Malvern, a high-risk community in Toronto. And Phil Groff is a psychologist and Director of Research and Evaluation with Smart Risk, an organization dedicated to preventing injuries and saving lives. If you have a question for our panel, you can get it to us two ways. If you're watching us online, you can type your question in the Ask the Expert box that's below your video screen. You can also call us toll-free at 1-888-891-1195. As an incentive, we're giving away 3 copies of Michael Unger's books to people whose questions make it to air. Now remember to include your phone number or your email address so we can contact you if you win. Now, if you want to talk to other parents out there, you can join our chat. That's going on right now, screen right. And remember to vote in our polls. The first one is already up on our website, and we'll give you those results in a little later in the show. We're also encouraging you to take our quiz, created in consultation with Barbara Colaroso. It will help you determine just how protective you are. About 3,000 of you have taken it so far. Here are the results. 22% of you are underprotective, 46% are balanced, and 31% of you are overprotective. Now, Barbara, you consulted with us to create that quiz. What do you make of the results?
Well, first of all, so my family doesn't think I've fled home. I'm not from Boston. I'm from Littleton, Colorado.
Right,
I have been for years, so I don't want
But your organization is in Boston, is that right? Okay.
No, I don't know where Boston came from, but
We will.
I just wanted my family to know
Thank you.
Yes, that
you
I
haven't
haven't
moved.
fled in fear. No, I would say that some people probably fudged on that, because we know in our heads what the right answers are. But as the man in the little vignette you showed said, your heart, it's a little different. So if we answered it from the head, chances are there'd be more in the middle. But if we really answered it from the heart, I'm suspecting that number on the fearful side would have been a bit higher in this culture.
Is that what you see?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that, and it's afraid about the things that are probably the least things we should be afraid of, because it defies the statistics. You're most at risk at home and in the car. And as somebody was saying before, what we tend to do is drive our kids every place and tell them they have to stay home.
Now, we're going to get to that a little later in the show. But Michael, you wrote the book on overprotective parents. How typical is the family that we saw?
Oh, exactly what I'm hearing, both in my clinical practice and as I tour around the kinds of families that are coming forward. I mean, they said some really brilliant things. The first is you really get a sense of how much those parents love those kids. And fundamentally, that's I think where this whole thing starts from, is not, when we think about sort of bubble wrapping our kids or overprotection, I mean, let's start at the beginning. We're doing it because we love and we really want the best for these kids. Time and again, though, I do see families that unfortunately, I think sometimes, and they get a hint of it, we know that we're doing something different than when we were growing up, and we begin to worry that maybe in this overprotectiveness, we're also not giving our kids the building blocks or those cornerstones of the things they also need to become really well-functioning adults. And I know we'll get into that a bit more here this evening.
Well, where does this trend come from then, this trend towards overprotection, if we know what's happening?
Well, as near as I can tell, there's about 2 key things that I see happening. One is the shrinking family. This family had 3 kids, which is a bit unusual in Canada and across North America. But when you start having smaller families, I think there's a little bit of a tendency to want to make sure that those children have everything. And as adults, as their parents, we have a little bit more time and attention. Not that we neglected our kids when we had 6 or 8 of them, but there is a sort of a sense of parents are telling me they want to complete themselves a little bit more through their kids and their kids' achievements. We're caught up with our kids in a very close way. Of course, the media plays a little bit of a factor. I'm not blaming the media because, of course, as adults and parents, we want the media to tell us everything. But when every time a child is hurt anywhere in the world, be it Portugal, southern United States, northern Canada, Japan, anywhere, it feels through this kind of media blitz that it's happening right in our very backyard, when in fact, as these parents know, the statistics say it's not happening.
Sure. Now, Anthony, what do you think? Where is this trend coming from?
Well,
Do you agree?
when one thing happens, it's a tragedy. If it's on a mass scale, it becomes a statistic. And I think we always want to face to a story. And if you listen to some of the examples that are coming forward, I'm afraid of the stranger abduction. I'm afraid of something a pedophile. And even in our agency, I talked to some of my early childhood development facilitators today. I said, why would your parents and why is your parents? And it's amazing to listen to them say, I'm afraid of the child abductor. I'm afraid of the pedophile. And I'm saying, but the statistical probability of those things happening is so minuscule. But yet we live in an age of the face makes the story. So when you see that front page pedophile or you hear about the stranger abduction, it penetrates us at a very personal level, and that's a very powerful psychological impact, and we internalize that. And then when we internalize that, but just in terms of the survey, one thing I'd always know as a statistician is who actually responded to that survey. Because it'd be interesting to know if it, like maybe what some of the ethnic compositions were, because you do find some groups tend to be more overprotective and so forth, and so, but it'd be interesting.
Thank you. Now, Barbara, what do you hear from people? What are parents worried about? Is it?
It's the things that we should least worry about.
Right.
And my whole career has been built on raising responsible and resourceful, resilient human beings who can stand up for values and against injustices. And it starts with something very young, red pajama, blue pajama, letting kids make decisions that are age appropriate and ability appropriate and take reasonable risks. It was interesting to me that on the playground they were letting the little girl climb a rock wall, practicing climbing a rock wall, and someone's there to guide her and give her some support, but letting her do it, but not letting her go to a sleepover except for in her sister's bed. And you could hear the disdain in that young girl's voice, except in my sister's bed, when her peers are so critical. And if she's not allowed to hang with her peers without adult supervision, she will not be buffered enough to stand up for herself or for anyone else when that high-status social bully in middle school says, I'm not going to like the new girl, so if you'd like to be in my group, you won't like her either. So she was very obedient to her parents, even if she was disdainful of the things they wouldn't let her do. And now she's going to be very obedient to that young girl because she's not practiced making choices and decisions or been able to take risks. It takes a lot of courage to stand up and say, I'm going to sit next to the new girl. But it doesn't start just there. It starts at the little thing, red pajama, blue pajama.
Right.
3 outfits, pick one.
Okay.
And climbing the little rock wall with somebody guiding her. And then she'll be climbing her mountains.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, we did poll some parents in Toronto, and almost everyone said their biggest fear was that their child would be abducted by a stranger. Statistically, though, that is rare. The latest national figures are from 2006. 372 children were abducted that year. The vast majority, 326 children, were kidnapped by one of their parents. The remaining 46 children were taken by people other than their parents, including relatives, family friends, neighbors, and strangers. Now, to put those numbers in context, that same year, 47,000 children ran away from home. The most deadly risk for children is the car. National collision statistics from 2006 show that 448 children died in motor vehicle accidents. In that same year, more than 29,000 kids across Canada were admitted to hospital with injuries sustained in the home. 182 of those children died. 37% of all injuries were caused by unintentional falls. So, children are most at risk in the car or at home, and yet our response is to drive our kids everywhere and to keep them indoors. Now, Phil, how does that make any sense?
Well, I think you have to remember what it is that we perceive as risky, which may not be what's really risky out there. Risks are perceived as greater when we feel it's something that's being done to us, something we had no voluntary control over, and when it's something that we don't feel we have any personal ability to manage. And so, for example, we all find driving our automobiles very safe, very low-risk activities, whereas we're all a little bit nervous, some of us more than others, when we take an airplane flight. despite the fact that that airline pilot has much more experience, much more training at flying that plane than we have at operating our car. And as we know just from the statistics alone, it's orders of magnitude more dangerous to drive to the airport than to fly between two airports.
So that's why the actual statistics aren't very persuasive. It's a matter of control.
It's a matter of control. It's a matter of that sense of familiarity.
Okay, we have a question here from Barbara in Vancouver. How much do you think this sense of paranoia is media driven? Who would like to answer that question? Michael, Barbara?
That's George Bush.
Yeah, I think it is media driven, but it isn't solely media driven. It's how we as parents perceive a lot of that, and the media, as you said, it's that face that we see of the child that's abducted. It's the face of fear. And in my own country, I'm an American. We have become a very fearful nation to where, you know, our shampoo is putting us at risk at the airport.
Right.
That's not labeled, no matter what's in it. If it's labeled, it's okay mindset, which is so ridiculous, rather than looking and profiling and saying, let me get an idea of how safe this really is. So when a whole culture feeds into it, of course the media is a part of that. So I think we have to look at the media as one segment of control and imbuing that fear. But there's others, our own parental messages, the community that our children are growing up in. If everyone and their brother is watching everyone and getting to know one another in a small community in a big city, because you can have small community in big city, that's very different than that anonymity that you can even have in a small town.
And that's really talking back to that, to sort of build on that, is that if we can, as a community, begin to talk back, one of the things that kids really respect is when a parent assesses the risk accurately around them. So in my community, how many stranger abductions really have happened and what really is the risk? So if you tell a kid in a very high risk, dangerous community, I want you home at 5 o'clock after, no dallying after, doing anything after school, you get your butt back here, the kid's going to respect you because they can see the guns and the drugs and the danger in their community. But most of us do not live in those kinds of high-risk communities. And if you tell a kid, and you see it in the girl in the clip, if you begin to feed that to a child, then they kind of go, well, Mom, Dad, you're off base, you're not credible. What's more, or they have to internalize it and say, oh my gosh, this must be a very dangerous world. And you heard that girl say it.
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe I'm going to get abducted. Maybe the bathroom's dangerous. Maybe my world's dangerous. And you grow this kind of anxious child, which we're seeing in our universities and colleges.
Okay, we
later on.
have a question now on the phone from Emily in Toronto. Emily, hi.
Hi.
Hi, what's your question?
My question is, I live in a neighborhood in Toronto where W5 had done a show where they had lured pedophiles to a house around the corner from where I live. Also closely by is an elementary school and a middle school attached to it. Now, after the show was broadcast, so the show actually set it up. A landlord in our area rented their house out to the show W5, from what I believe, and W5 ran the show out of it where they lured the pedophile under the disguise of a 12-year-old was in that house, and pedophiles arrived, and then W5 busted the pedophiles as they arrived. And so one of the things that we were concerned about as parents in the community was now, W5 in this situation, sure, I guess that they were trying to help reveal a whole trade that's out there, but on the other hand, it introduced our neighborhood to a number of pedophiles and people that we weren't prepared to share ourselves with.
Right. Okay, so you're wondering if they should have been there at all. Is that the question?
Well, I think it ties into the whole idea of the media again. And are they helping? Is it hurting?
Yes. Okay, Anthony?
Well, I think, media has a responsibility to society, but media really reflects our society. Barry Glasner put out a book called The Culture of Fear not too long ago. And one of the things that we have to look at for the insurance industry, for example, is completely premised on fear. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that bets that none of the things that we expect are going to happen, and they don't happen. That's why the insurance industry is such a multi-billion-dollar field. Now in schools, for example, you can have insurance. Your kid goes to school in kindergarten, grade 1. The first thing they get hit with the welcome to school letter is insurance papers to say, insure your kid for playground things, knowing that these are very unlikely incidents. So I think to say, well, it's just about the media having that impact. Yes, media has a role to play. We talked earlier about a man who murdered his own 3 kids, but the stats show it. You're more likely to experience something terrible happening by your own parent, abduction or so forth, or an accident in the home. But in terms of what makes the news, it's what is different. And so when something is different, that's what gets reported in the media. But we internalize it, but to blame it isn't the right way. I'd say look at our overall economic structure, and that is just the way we condition our society as a whole.
Okay, Barbara, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and Gavin de Becker wrote a phenomenal book called The Gift of Fear, and then he wrote a book, Protecting the Gift. And his whole sense was we have a natural, healthy fear built in us to keep us alive. But when we burden it with all the fear that's not real, like that young girl saying, I'm afraid I'll be abducted, then her natural fear clue isn't tuned in to something in the environment. Maybe it's an interesting uncle, maybe it's an interesting aunt, or a teacher. If you feel uncomfortable, I want to teach a child, if you feel uncomfortable, this is what you can do. And I would also never tell a child to say, please stop. I would say, yell fire. We tend to respond to fire. But then they can use that in any situation where they feel uncomfortable.
Right.
And to give them a sense where if you go to preschool, even that young, and that child is crying and not wanting to go, let them listen to their gut and we listen to them. And it's being tuned in to that sense. And then a child can actually walk down a dark street that they may not have wanted to walk down but must. And if they're not fearful of what's going to happen to them, their body will speak to them and actually either stop in its tracks or move your adrenaline quickly to get out. It's beautiful if it really works.
And this is actually very wise. And
Yes.
there's actually some good research on the fact if you have 2 children at the top of a lovely ski hill, double black diamond run, and the child who has pushed himself or herself through some risky experiences is more likely the one to get to the bottom of that hill safe, even though they might actually push themselves into some higher risk activities. But because of their confidence, they're going to know how to move their body through time and space and make it down. It's that nervous child who's being held back all the time, which we know from actual studies have shown this, is more likely to end up in the ambulance at the end of that ski day.
In a tree.
Right. Well, you know
In
what
the
they say
tree.
in the tree. Well, what they say when you're skiing is that you have to commit. When you're standing at the top of that hill, you have to commit, and it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
A lot of parents are also scared of being the bad parent. If you're that parent who that one incident happens and something goes wrong, you're labeled as a bad parent, and that same fear that's natural within us, it gets overinflated,
Sure.
and then that plays out too. And a lot of parents who I've talked to, the number one thing they say is, I want to protect my child because I love them and I want to be a good parent.
Absolutely. We have a call question here that we need to take right now, and then we have a call. It's easy to say don't be overprotective if you haven't had your child abused or abducted. What do you say to those who have lived it? Do you just ignore the past? This is from Ben.
I wrote a book, Parenting Through Crisis. And Viktor Frankl, a death camp survivor, talked about tragic optimism. That isn't the rose-colored optimism where we say to a kid, all's right with the world, because it's not. But with that child who's had some harm done to them, can you, when you've been brought through this horrific grief, get up in the morning, fix some breakfast, and say, we're going to make it through this? Whether it's been a child rape, a child abduction, the horrors of horrors. My own children, one of mine was diagnosed with cancer, which brought us to our knees. A very healthy, she's now a stunt woman, daughter. But we had to say, we can get through this. And that was that sense of optimism that the doctors noted in her. Well, I can get through this, I can get through this, whatever getting through means. And so it's that sense of when a kid has been harmed, our inclination as parents is to pull back with all the other kids. You got a teenager who's pregnant, her sisters won't be allowed to date till they're 25.
Right.
Because we'll pull back. And instead what we have to say is, in each situation, with each child, they're different. My kids are like day, night, and afternoon. Giving them age-appropriate, ability-appropriate risks. And as you said, the more they take those risks, the more confident they are in standing up to the other kids.
Okay, let's take a phone call from David right now. David is calling from Toronto. Hi, David.
Hi, this is a great show.
Thank you.
I think the overall element that we're dealing with this fear, at least for me, having grown up in Niagara Falls but now living in Toronto, but even feeling it when I was growing up in Niagara Falls, is the times have changed. We used to trust everybody. Today we have to more or less earn our trust or earn people's trust, both the things that have been happening at churches and around people's neighborhoods, and also everything's different now. It's not a white Anglo-Saxon kind of community. We are exposed to different cultures, so we have to learn to understand their way of life, and so there's always these fears, and I think these fears come from having to learn to trust other people.
Did you have a question that you wanted to ask somebody on our panel?
Well, I was just wondering what they felt about that, whether that's an avenue that maybe needs more understanding.
Thank you.
I get the sense sometimes that actually the world is shifting, and we see it sometimes as this globalized thing that's actually more frightening. And yet, if you actually work with kids and talk to the kids themselves, maybe others can see this too, but I get the sense that kids are actually more global and more accommodating and more tolerant, and they are actually becoming much more able to navigate their worlds than we. I'm in my mid-40s, and I don't think that we had the same set of skills that I see in the very young people that I think sometimes we're worried about.
Well, you see the playground effect. I mean, kids tend to get together on the playground and they mix and they mingle. They don't really begin to distrust till they go back home, and then the parents trying to tell them who not to trust or who not to associate
Right, so
with.
you're saying these messages are coming from the parents, not the children.
Well, a lot of those kind of messages come from the parents, but I mean, I think that when you look at the way kids are in terms of their risk levels and risk, the thing goes, it's same with investments, right? If you take the risk, you get the reward. If they take the risk, they become a better skier. And then in terms of, we're talking about globalization and the world and different cultures, and one thing he said is, the Anglo-Saxon neighborhood, but I would say that it doesn't really matter what the ethnic composition is, right? People are people, that maybe they have different cultural things, but what you find is that some cultures, in terms of the way they're more communal in the way that they approach their children. And I think in an individualistic society, which North America is, we tend to see this fear effect a lot more prominently than, let's say, in more communal settings.
Okay, Phil?
I think we've come to take a lot of things for granted in our society, and I think in some ways, in part because our lives have been easier than our parents' lives, than their parents' lives, we're not struggling for survival quite as much. I think we find ourselves in a position where we expect everything can be perfect all the time, and therefore everything should be safe. And I think one of the best messages, if you want to be a responsible parent, if you want to raise resilient kids, is to recognize there is no place called safe.
Right.
Right. Risk is an inevitable and a beneficial part of our lives. And it's learning to navigate those risks, manage those risks in the smartest way possible that let you enjoy life to the fullest.
Okay, now Michael, you coined the phrase bubble-wrapped kids in your book. You talked about that. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's that phenomenon of actually overprotecting the kids, but I think what I was really trying to suggest is that there's a risk-taker's advantage to some of the risk, and Smart Risk does this. They put kids into risky situations, and I really have a lot of respect for the work that Phil and your organization do, because they put kids out there. And what I'm learning a little bit from the families that I'm working with is telling me that kids do better when they actually are exposed to those kinds of incremental decisions that they can handle and they can chew on. And if we bubble wrap them, if we cushion every bump and bruise, and I'm talking about abuse, because that was coming up before. We're not talking about the abused child now. We're talking about a child who's raised in a secure environment. We can actually do more harm, potentially, by denying them a risky experience, some of those adventures, some of that responsibility, the risk-taker's advantage. Because how are they going to make those incremental steps towards being an independent, autonomous, and healthy adult?
Right. Okay. Well, we've been saying that parents are doing all sorts of things to keep their kids safe. We wanted to see what kind of protection your money can buy, so we visited the Safety Superstore in Mississauga.
Make a concerted effort to offer to the public things that are safe for their children. That's what we do. Making your world a safer place is our motto.
These are neat, huh?
This is our selection of safety belts and toddler harnesses. These are used to keep your little guy from running away from you when you turn your head for a second. So it just slips on over top of their shoulders and snaps on underneath their arms. Some parents look at this as a bit draconian, but those ones that have children and know how quickly that they can get away from you in dangerous situations, then this is a very important tool to have. This is your family medical journal, and it encompasses a lot of things, and it even has a page that you can record the fingerprints of the children and attach a photo, and also attach a couple of strands of hair for DNA analysis if the child should ever go missing. Losing their children, especially when in theme parks and busy malls, and we have a product that lets them know if they wander too far away, and that's called the Angel Alert Child Distance Monitor. One piece gets attached to the child, the other piece the parent has. When the two pieces go past a certain point, that the parent's piece automatically alarms, letting them know that they need to rescope and find the children. There's also a panic button on the child's piece, so that if they encounter any problems with anybody or find themselves lost, they press the button and your piece goes off, letting them know that they need assistance.
Yeah.
Parents can never be too overprotective. They have to understand these children are priceless. You can never replace them.
Okay, we saw harnesses, GPS systems, DNA kits. Phil, what do you make of all of that?
I can't help but notice that the parents who are most concerned about their children falling prey to criminals are in effect employing the techniques that we typically use on criminals with their children.
Right.
We're fingerprinting them, we're going to restrain them, we're going to put monitors on them.
Okay.
I think it's just great to clone your child with that DNA thing there. So
make another one if something happens.
But and you'll probably get a reduction in your insurance rates if you buy these kind of things. So I'm serious about that, because this is the way if you have an alarm on your house, they give you a cut rate.
Well, what kind of message does all of this send to children?
Hate this stuff.
They do.
Yeah.
Kids hate.
And teenagers who are being monitored constantly and are going to be out of your home 2 years from now on their absolute own are going to be suffering far more than a kid who's been allowed to make choices when they're still cheap to make.
Do you think kids feel safer or more scared with this?
More scared.
Yes.
And then you don't listen to your natural fear clues. The best alarm is a kid yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs if something is happening to them.
If you have a helmet on, actually, it's interesting. Let's separate this a little bit, though.
Sure.
What they didn't show was the helmets and some of the very sensible stuff that we still
Wristbands for rollerblading.
We still want that. And
Yes.
let's not get this confused. That makes sense. But this kind of I want a child to know that they don't run on the street, so that I don't want them on a harness. I want them to understand my command if I need to do that, but I also want them to judge their own self a little bit. So I don't want them on a harness, because I want them to learn about how to keep themselves safe. And as Barbara just said, the consequences are much fewer, because chances are they're not going to get
Do you
very
think
far
it's a
from
little
me.
more work, though, to do it that way?
Definitely more work.
Right.
Absolutely.
And if you look at time use studies, like this again is what does it take to be a good parent? And I think when we take shortcut messages like this kind of compromises what I might say good parenting strategies. So because when you do use these kind of things, you send subliminal messages. It's unsafe, you're unsafe, you need this to keep you safe, I'm going to do this to keep you safe. And it's discouraging our kids from taking risks or maturing,
Okay, well, let's take a look at the results from our poll. We've had a poll online for a while, and we asked the question, is the world more dangerous today than when you were a child? Here's what we found. 51% of you have said yes. 37% have said no, and 12% of you have said in some ways. Now, thank you for your input on that, and please vote in our second poll, which is up on our site now. I'll give you those results a little later. And don't forget to vote to take our quiz and find out where you are on the protection spectrum. Here are the results of the quiz at the moment. 23% of you are underprotective, 46% are balanced, and 31% are overprotective. Now, don't forget to, if you want to talk to other parents out there, you can join our chat, and our panel is here to answer your questions. So if you're online, you can type them in the Ask the Expert box, which is below the video, or you can call us toll-free at 1-888-891-1195. Now, statistically, crime is at its lowest point in 25 years.
In Canada.
In Canada, right, not in the U.S.
Not
Is that what you're trying to say?
In some of our cities, it's actually going up, and I think again, it's part of that fear.
Why do you think people do that? But here it's
yes,
at its
is.
lowest. So why are people so afraid? Why did our poll show that people think it's more dangerous?
Well, I was just going to say, when I was talking to again some parents at the Resource Center in Brampton, and today before I came on, and I said, I'm going to do the show. What do you think? And a lot of them answered that exact point. We think the world is a more dangerous place. And I said, okay, well, why do you think the world is a more dangerous place? And they're like, well, we don't really know. But if you ask the same people, do you believe the media messages that you hear? You're probably going to get the same kind of response rates. 31% will say yes, probably 50% will say no, and then 20% will say I'm not sure. So you're probably it's interesting, but I think we internalize at a subliminal level media messages, but instead of in terms of believing it at a superficial level.
Okay, well, let's talk about the real risks for a moment. We established earlier that the real risks are the car and the home really are the most dangerous places to be. What are the specific things that parents need to worry about?
Specifically, it's those unintentional injuries that we should be most concerned about, those things that we dismiss as accidents. And that's really part of the problem. We talk about stranger danger, we talk about other things in the media, in our classrooms, in our households, and they're kind of exciting and interesting to talk about. When someone gets hurt in an unintentional injury, we dismiss it as an accident. And if you look up what an accident means in the dictionary, you'll find it's an unavoidable act of fate.
Right.
Well, if something's unavoidable, if it's an act of fate, there's no motivation for prevention, and there's nothing that can be done about it. You just have to go into denial and say, well, it'll never happen to me.
Right. Well, there are all kinds of levels of injury. I mean, I'm thinking of toddlers when my children were young and they would, trip over a stair or fall into something, they'd get hurt. Well, I guess they'd learn not to do that again, is my hope. But obviously some injuries are more serious. So how do parents determine what they have to do in their home to keep their kids safe without overdoing it?
Well, again, I think that what Michael said a few minutes ago is very important. It's about reasonable precautions to manage risk, and it's about focusing on the right outcomes. You don't take these precautions so your kids don't get hurt. You take the precautions so they can live life, right? We don't put a helmet on our child so their head doesn't get fractured. You put a helmet on your child so they can enjoy the act of cycling.
Right. I like you describe that on your website. You talk about taking a risk but being smart about it, so preparing yourself
and preparing
to take it
for the positive benefit that you can gain from taking it.
Okay, we have a phone call here from Rick in St. Catharines. Hi, Rick.
Hi.
Hi.
I really love your panel, and I don't want to throw a curve at you, but I was originally wondering about, see, I'm a father from divorce, and I let my children take a lot of risks. I let them get muddy and climb trees. And I grew up on a farm, and that all seemed pretty natural to me. And my wife, she was pretty protective. And I'm wondering what your panel has to say about how different spouses can have influences, where that leads.
Thank you. That's a good question that I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in hearing about.
Well, we had an experience ourselves. I grew up in a rural community where you had to watch out for the cows if you were playing in the street. My husband grew up in North Denver where if you stepped off the curb, you got run over. And we were raising our kids in a cul-de-sac, a little area where there was one way to get in and it circled around. Fairly safe, but not the cows in the street, but also not stepping off. And our daughter came in and asked her dad if she could rollerblade in the street. His immediate response was no. Of course, she comes and asks Mom. And we've always taken the position that whoever you ask first, the other will back them up, just so they aren't pitting one. And I said, you asked the wrong person first, hon. But Daddy won't let me. And I went in and I said, Don, what's the issue within the cul-de-sac? And he said, oh my God, you know what I was thinking? I was thinking about my growing up. And what was I thinking about? My growing up.
Right.
Different areas. What we both had to come to is where is our daughter growing up and what sensibilities does she have? Rollerblading, does she know? Have we taught her to look when a car's coming in? Do you get off the curb? Have we taught her those things? And then her dad, rather than me overriding her dad said to her, now if you were at Grandma Helen's, would you play out in the street? Oh no, we get run over. When you go to Grandma Regan's, oh no, we just watch out for the cows. She got it, and he said, you know how to rollerblade out in the street. I made a mistake.
When
it's doing both. It's saying, where are we at here?
Right.
And you know what? Having two different sets of parents, kids figure it out real fast. Who to ask for what.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, when you go to the hockey rink or the soccer field, and you got the parents there, and it's always inevitable. The kid gets hurt on the ice, and you hear one parent. Mostly, it tends to be the mother. I'm not going to knock moms, but they'll go, "Oh my God!" Well, first of all, they're playing hockey. It's or they're playing soccer. They're going to get, and usually you get the father going, "Oh, let them. They need to toughen up and get strong or whatever." So you do see these kind of dynamics going off between parents.
Sure.
And so we do know that parenting style. Now I had the overprotective mother who wouldn't even let me near a hockey rink or near a soccer field. So that was a total extreme. But you do see that phenomenon. I'd like to hear what
sure.
I mean with
I think Michael has a point here.
And it's interesting because when you actually, and I want to respond to the caller because he's got a very,
he has to deal with the situation.
you're in the throes of this situation, and when I work with families like that, you can't have the conversation with the parents in the same room, but I would ask questions like, and it follows on what Barbara just said. Try and find out what it was that your spouse was doing when she was growing up. I generally walk people through a very simple three sets of questions. What were you doing at that same age? Kind of what kinds of risks and responsibilities did you have? If your child's trying to do something like climb a tree or whatever it is, understand that behavior as best you can, and then try and find a safe alternative or a substitution. But it starts with looking back and saying, what was the benefits to us growing up? And that might be, if you have a good relationship with your spouse enough that you can ask, well, what were you doing when we were growing up? What did we have? And what benefits did those experiences give us growing up? And maybe that's a conversation the two partners can still have.
Okay, thank you. Now let's talk about that for a minute, though, because I want to find out why we do need to do this. Why do we need to let our kids take these risks?
Because they are foundational to what we need as human beings. I do a lot of research all around the world in 5 continents, and where this book kind of came out of, Too Safe for Their Own Good, where it actually stimulated from, was I was in countries like in Medellin, Colombia, and with people in China, and all kinds of other very, very off the beaten path in Africa. I would get back to Canada, and I would have seen children in high-risk situations. I'd get off the airplane, and I'd move into basically middle-class communities in this country, and people were responding to their children as if they were on the streets in these very dangerous communities elsewhere in the world. And what those children everywhere else were teaching me was that there are key things that they need to grow up healthy despite the risks that they face. Things like rites of passage, those transition points to getting older, proving yourself in your community and to your family. And yet at the very time that our children need that, I think sometimes what we do out of love and out of concern, we hold our children back from the very thing that parents in really dangerous communities know are actually going to help their kids.
Okay, now earlier we talked about the societal pressures that parents often feel to keep their kids very safe. We have somebody on the phone now that's going to talk to us a bit about that. I'm joined by Lenore Skenazy. She's on the phone from New York. Hi, Lenore.
In the middle of Manhattan right now.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for joining us. Now, you let your 9-year-old take the subway alone, your son. How come?
Because he wanted to. He knew how to read a map. We take subways and buses all the time here, and it didn't seem like a big deal. So I said, okay. One day I took him to a department store here, and I said, today's the day, and he was really excited, and I said goodbye, and he found his way home. It was no big deal until it became an international news story for something that, like you were saying earlier, it's things that we did as kids ourselves that were not big deals then.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. You wrote about this in the New York Sun, right? You wrote an article. What was the reaction after that?
The reaction after that was that night, the Today Show called. I got a call from Howard Stern. The next day, my son and I were on, NBC here and MSNBC and Fox News and National Public Radio, and it's just, and here we are in Canada. For some reason, it struck a nerve, and you never know when you're going to strike it. I mean, God forbid you're a dentist, but there it was.
And what are people saying to you?
Well, I'd say that the people who actually end up writing to me, most of them are, I'd say about 5 to 1 in favor, like bravo and hooray, and you're a great mom. And if they knew I'm like not a great mom. I am a terrible, awful, normal mom like everybody else, and this is just something that he wanted to do. But for some reason, people who call up talk shows are crazy nut jobs, and they're all saying, why would you risk your son on this crazy expedition for just one day of fun when otherwise he could have lived to have a nice, long life? And just the two choices were put him on the subway and have him killed for your own dumb experiment, or let him live a safe life by watching over him every step of the way until he's 25.
Well, why do you think they're saying those things to you?
I think people have lost the ability to distinguish between a minor safety concern and a major safety concern. I mean, one of the talk show hosts was saying that he would never let his son play out in the front yard without him watching him the whole time. He's 8. And I'm thinking, well, why don't you just move to Guantanamo then, and you could be watched 24 hours a day? Because there's no freedom in that life. And he thinks that I'm weird that I let my kid do something that I thought was very safe. And, of course, I think that he's weird keeping his son really under 24-hour surveillance as if there's just been a prison break in the area and they have to be very concerned. There's something strange to me that people can't tell the difference between sort of like normal life and a very dangerous situation. Every situation to them is dangerous except the ones they're really familiar with, like driving in a car, which, by the way, is 40 more times.
Right, which we've talked about.
Your kid, yeah.
Well, what do you want to say to all those people then that are giving you such a hard time?
Well, of course, I would like to say that let's try not to judge each other. I'm really trying not to judge you, and try not to judge me, because we all think we're doing the best for our kids. But I think that if they do the little exercise that the man before me was talking about, just look back on their own childhoods. Everybody does, and they look back really fondly on that moment that they rode the bike to the library, that they got on the train and went to the ball game. And see that they survived, and try to remember the world is not that much different today, even though it feels different because they hear more scary stories because there's cable TV.
Right.
I think they'd be happier, and if they feel like checking in, they can go to my new website dedicated to raising kids the way we were raised. Not that it was necessarily perfect, but it's freerangekids.com.
Okay, well, you know what? We're going to post that on our website, and thank you very much for joining us, Lenore.
Oh, thanks. It was fun. Off I go into the night.
Thank you. Okay, Lenore Skenazy spoke to us from New York City. Barbara, how do parents buck the trend?
Well, Lenore did it.
Yeah.
And what was beautiful about what she said, one of the things that was beautiful, is she said she had practiced with her son. They took the subway often. He knew how to read, and she made it, as you said, an adventure. That this is a new landmark for you, that you can take the subway, and she probably taught him to be sensible about it and what to do if. It's always good to say what to do if you get lost.
Right.
And if he's armed with that, so to speak, he will be a much more confident human being, willing not only to take the subway, but to help somebody else out.
Okay.
To be able to stand up for a child that's being targeted by somebody else. It all fits together. I have to applaud her, and I can understand I've gotten a little grief about some things I've let my kids do too. So
Well, it sounds like they've turned out all right.
They're doing
Okay,
well.
we have a phone call now from Rob in Toronto. Hi, Rob. Hi, Rob. Okay, Rob is not there anymore. And Michael, how do parents know, though, if they are being overprotective? It sounds like her son was ready to go and he was excited about it, but how do parents know if their children aren't?
There's a
Do they
very
always
key
ask?
point here, which, Lenore, beautiful example. She's living downtown New York. Now, if you don't live downtown New York and your kids aren't riding, 9-year-olds aren't on the subway, that might seem an extreme behavior. But we have to keep this in perspective. It's culture-based. And one of the things I constantly, when I'm working with families, ask them, what's fitting for you in your culture? What's in your community? What's the norm, in a sense? That this was a reasonable experience. This was a kid who's on the subways all the time. He knows the dangers. He's been coached for years. This makes sense. When I'm up in high Arctic in Canada, I've watched 10-year-olds on skidoos out hunting caribou and using long knives and all kinds of other things. And I was, at the same time as I was up there, I was debating with my own, at the time, my son was 10 years old, and we were debating about giving him a 2-inch pocket knife while I was watching other children hunting caribou in the far north and driving their own snowmobiles. In other words, but I would argue that debate was that those kids couldn't have made it necessarily on the streets of where I live, nor could my son have made it up there.
Right.
We need, it's a step by step, and I think that's how I think that's what I would encourage parents to think about. What's appropriate that I'm comfortable with? Lenore obviously has been coaching this kid really well.
Now, how does it work, Anthony, in the neighborhood where you live, for instance?
Well,
how do parents know what's appropriate and what isn't?
In some of the at-risk communities, it can be different, but the fact is a lot of the kids who live in the at-risk communities aren't fearful. You know, they basically know, you know, if you stay away from certain people or certain areas, then you're not going to get into trouble, so you can avoid it. If you want to get it, it'll find you. But Michael used a term, which I think especially in African Canadian projects that are going through some social service agencies now, rites of passage. Because what that does is it teaches kids things like judgment skills, it teaches them leadership skills, and so basically if in these rites of passage types of processes, that's what they're learning: leadership, judgment, and decision-making skills. And if we could get back to that, and that's what happens in a lot of the at-risk communities. A lot of the kids, because we have a lot of latchkey kids in Jane Finch and Malvern and Rexdale and so forth, and Bramalea. And so these are 6, 7, 8-year-old kids who are going home by themselves, opening the door, or coming back, in certain cases, or going home after school because they can't afford daycare. Right. And so what do you say about those parents? Are they bad parents? No, they're sitting there working two jobs to try and make ends meet and buy food and pay rent. So the kids have no. And we have to talk about low-income kids, because that's another whole issue. Because then you can't even judge parenting and call them bad parents, because the parents are sitting there working. So I think we need to pay attention to some of the processes that Michael hit on in terms of the judgment and the leadership skills and the decision making. And if we could teach our kids those kinds of things, then 7, 8, 9, and so forth, they'll be fine.
Okay, now we asked some kids in Toronto what they think of all this overprotection.
They're also doing it for my safety. That's what I understand. But sometimes it can be overprotective.
My parents are careful. I don't think they're overprotective at all. They care about my well-being, and I'm not much of a risk taker. I don't feel comfortable going out by myself, so I don't really mind.
I think parents need to be careful about their kids, but they also should let their kids know that they should be responsible for themselves, because parents can't be with them all the time. So there are a lot of times the kid is going to be by him or by herself. So the kid must know that to protect him or herself, because parents not going to always be there for them.
I would say that my mom is very overprotective, and my dad is just right. He doesn't protect me too much, that I can't do anything, but he just doesn't let me do whatever I want.
My parents will not let me go out after dark or walk around with my friends at night. I have to be home before sundown. It's like a Cinderella kind of deal.
Okay, well, as we said earlier, today's parents admit they enjoyed a lot more freedoms than we give our kids now. Nothing bad really happened to them most of the time, and yet they treat their kids so differently. Where is the disconnect, or why is there a disconnect, Michael?
Boy, why is the disconnect? I'm somewhere in it, we've connected with a lot more fear. We're focusing in on our kids, just perhaps, it's going to sound a bit strange, but often with parents, what I'll encourage them to do is they're really focusing in on their kids, and they're not giving them the same risk-taker's advantage that they had growing up. I often tell them, let's talk about your life a little bit. Where are you getting some excitement? How else are you going to fulfill yourself and complete yourself?
That's a good idea.
Now, most parents are doing this out of love and concern. I never doubt that. But if our whole focus becomes driving our child every day to school, picking them up at lunch and bringing them home, and then driving them back to school, I know someone's doing this, and then driving them 4 drives in the day.
Right.
My saying is, maybe you need to join a gym. Maybe you just got to go find your own friends, and we've got to move that up. So that's a little bit of that, and I think our kids appreciate when they have a little bit more time and space in their own lives to take on some of those responsibilities.
Okay, we have another phone call now from Rob in Toronto. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Hi there.
Thanks for taking my call. I grew up in Toronto I was a child in Toronto in the early 60s, mid-60s. My parents weren't overprotective, but I remember being warned never to go to the ravine. And I never quite knew why I wasn't supposed to go to the ravine, but boy, did I find any opportunity to go to the ravine. And I'm wondering now, my concern is, are we encouraging children's fear and compliance, but are we also encouraging defiance in many of these children? Because, it was forbidden fruit, and boy, did I do it. And
Okay.
I turned out okay.
Thank you very much. That's a great question.
Well, first of all, if you want a kid to do something, tell them not to do it.
Right.
This is a golden rule. And we have great services in Ontario, like these Ontario Early Years Centers, where we facilitate under 6 development with children. If we could get messages in those centers, drastically underfunded by our province, we should basically be putting more money to get people like Michael and Barbara to talk to parents who frequent these types of services, to teach positive kinds of ways of engaging with your kids, to teach them to take risk in balanced ways. and using their materials, because this is what we need now, because we are creating a society of fear, right? And we're encouraging kids to be fearful, and that's all of the messaging that's really going out right now.
Well, and Phil, it sounds like that caller was also saying that he was never told why he shouldn't go to the ravine. There was not much explanation for him.
Exactly, and I think that was part of the problem there. And notice it's the typical way we often phrase our safety messages. We tell kids, don't do this or you'll get hurt. We already talked about the problem with just focusing on the negative consequence. There's a problem with just having the negative message up front too. Telling people what not to do, well, we know that there are kids who are going to react to that and they're going to immediately want to do it. It's also the fact that telling someone what not to do tells them absolutely nothing about what the options are for them to do.
Right, okay, that's a very good point. Now, thank you. We have put up a second poll online, and let's take a look at the results of that now. We wanted to look at what happens if children are overprotective, and here's what you've had to say. 29% of you say that they will become risk-averse adults. 38% say they will be unsure about their choices. 29% of you say they will become dependent on others. 5% of you say that they will be happy and secure. What do you think of those results?
I think the top three, they will be all of those, not just one of them. And the concern I have not only with the risk, and again, it's with my work in obedience and in genocide, and people being easily led and doing to please. When they are not allowed to make basic risk decisions, they also then become very obedient to somebody who's very powerful. And that does not make for a democracy. Then we'll do whatever our government tells us to do or whatever a group of peers tells us to do. And I want to raise kids who can think critically, not just an independent thinker, but to think through and to know why I don't want you to go to the ravine. And I would say you can go to the ravine when you have two adults with you or an adult with you, or you can do these things. You can get on the subway once you can demonstrate that you have some common sense and the ability to read signs and ask for help.
Sure. Michael, what are the implications
it's very
for
much about
kids
saying yes
and our society? Well, what are the implications, though, if we don't?
If we don't, then what we're seeing, well, we're already seeing it. We're seeing universities full of kids who plagiarize. We're seeing or very, very anxious children. We're seeing a phenomenon where kids don't have that ability to go out into the world. They're losing. We're seeing the young adults right now without that sort of confidence to take on the challenges that I think they need to take on. So we're seeing that. Or in some cases, and we see this clinically, if you're denied the risk taker's advantage, you have two options. One is to become that anxious child, which the polls said, or the other one is you pull at the nearest apple, the lowest apple on the tree, and often that's things like delinquency and dangerous behaviors and early sexual initiation and all the stuff that we're talking about.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you very much. And that's all the time we have for tonight's show. My guests have been Barbara Coloroso, Michael Unger, Anthony Hutchinson, and Phil Groff. If you'd like more information, we've posted articles, links, and other resources on our website. Go to TVOparents.com, click on Your Voice and this show topic. You'll also find our discussion board, polls, and a quiz. We hope you'll join us again in our regular time slot, Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, online at TVOparents.com. I'm Cheryl Jackson. Good night.